What happens when a CEO goes undercover and discovers the company he built is failing from the inside? That's exactly what Daniel Morgan, the founder of BrewPoint Café, did when customer complaints and bad reviews started piling up. Disguised as a regular customer, this undercover CEO walked into one of his worst-rated stores, only to find overworked employees, toxic management, and a business that had lost its soul. But instead of walking away, he made it his mission to fix everything. Stay tuned to see how one decision changed the future of an entire company. Daniel Morgan sat in his sleek corporate office, staring at the reports piling up on his desk. The name BrewPoint Café had once been synonymous with warm service, quality coffee, and a welcoming atmosphere, but lately things had taken a turn. Customer complaints were rolling in, emails, online reviews, even whispers in board meetings. Words like rude staff, cold coffee, and terrible service kept surfacing, and Daniel couldn't ignore them any longer. How had his company, once built on passion and personal connection, become just another soulless coffee chain? A decade ago, BrewPoint had been his pride and joy. He had started with a single location where he knew every employee by name and worked behind the counter himself. Back then, every cup of coffee was made with care, every customer greeted with a smile. But now, with dozens of locations across the city, he had become distant, relying on managers and corporate strategies while losing touch with the reality on the ground. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and Daniel wasn't the kind of man to sit behind a desk and hope things would fix themselves. He needed to see the problem firsthand. So, for the first time in years, he ditched his tailored suits and expensive watch. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he prepared to walk into one of the worst-rated BrewPoint locations, not as a CEO, but as just another customer. If his company was failing, he needed to know why, and more importantly, he needed to fix it before it was too late. Daniel stepped onto the bustling sidewalk of Maple Street, where one of BrewPoint Café's busiest and most problematic locations stood. The exterior looked clean enough, but as he approached, he noticed fingerprints smudging the glass door and a discarded napkin fluttering near the entrance. Taking a deep breath, he pulled his hoodie tighter over his head and stepped inside. The moment he entered, the tension in the air hit him like a wall. The cafe was packed. Customers shuffled impatiently in a long line, some checking their watches, others tapping their fingers against the counters. The scent of coffee and fresh pastries filled the air, but so did something else: stress. Employees darted around behind the counter, their movements hurried and chaotic. No one smiled. The usual warmth he had once envisioned for his brand was nowhere to be found. As Daniel moved deeper into the cafe, his eyes swept over the details. The counter was littered with crumpled napkins, sticky syrup bottles left uncapped, and spilled coffee that no one had bothered to clean up. Near the pickup station, a customer sighed loudly as they inspected their drink, shaking their head in frustration before walking away without saying a word. Another customer leaned over to a stranger and muttered, "They always get my order wrong here." Behind the counter, the employees didn't look any better than the customers. One barista, her name tag reading Lisa, worked at the register with tired eyes as she took orders. A tall man, whom Daniel assumed was the shift supervisor, barked orders at the staff with thinly veiled irritation. A barista near the espresso machine dropped a cup, and instead of offering help, the supervisor shot him an annoyed glare before snapping, "Keep up, or you'll be the reason we fall behind." Daniel clenched his jaw, observing everything with a growing sense of unease. This wasn't just a bad day at one location. This was systemic failure. His company, the brand he had built with such pride, had turned into a place where both customers and employees were equally miserable. Taking his place at the end of the line, Daniel lowered his gaze, listening, watching, absorbing the reality of BrewPoint Café as it stood today. He had come in hoping that the reviews and complaints were exaggerated, but just minutes inside the store had already proven him wrong. As the line inched forward, he muttered under his breath, "It can't be this bad everywhere, can it?" From just a few feet ahead, a woman turned her head slightly, having overheard him. She gave a small, knowing smirk before whispering back, "Oh, it's bad." Daniel forced a casual nod, pretending to be just another frustrated customer, but deep inside his stomach churned. This was worse than he had expected. And if it was happening here, it was probably happening everywhere. Daniel shuffled forward in the slow-moving line, the growing impatience around him becoming more palpable with each passing minute. The customers ahead of him sighed loudly, checked their phones, and exchanged exasperated glances. Near the counter, a middle-aged man raised his voice at the barista, demanding to know why his order was taking so long. The employee barely looked up as she responded, "It's coming." No apology, no reassurance, just a flat, dismissive reply. As Daniel reached the front of the line, Lisa, the tired-eyed cashier, gave him a brief, robotic glance. She had a weary politeness about her, the kind that had been forced into place after too many long shifts and too little appreciation. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her fingers hovering over the register, eyes already shifting to the next customer in line. Daniel hesitated, deciding to test how the staff handled customer interaction. "I'm not sure," he said, adopting a thoughtful expression. "What do you recommend?" Lisa blinked, momentarily thrown off by the question. For a brief second, her tired demeanor softened, as if she wanted to give a real answer. But before she could speak, a sharp voice cut in. "Just order something," the shift supervisor, Mark, according to his name tag, barked from behind the counter. "We're backed up." Lisa flinched slightly, her posture stiffening before she quickly composed herself. The house blend is popular," she said quietly. "And we have fresh croissants." Daniel nodded, masking his frustration at how even the smallest attempt at engagement was being crushed. "I'll take a medium house blend and a croissant." Lisa rang up the order without another word, took his payment and handed him the receipt. No thank you, no smile, not because she didn't care, Daniel could see it in her face, but because she was moving on autopilot, worn down by the job. Stepping aside, he observed the pickup station. The counter was cluttered with half-empty cups, stray napkins, and a few abandoned orders. Employees moved frantically behind the bar, rushing through drinks with no care for presentation or accuracy. A young barista placed a latte on the counter and called out, "Cappuccino for Jake," before immediately turning away. A woman stepped forward, picked up the drink, and frowned. "I ordered an oat milk latte," she muttered, but the barista was already gone. She sighed and walked away without bothering to complain. A few moments later, Daniel's order arrived. He picked up the lukewarm coffee and croissant, its edges visibly stale. Testing the waters, he approached the counter again. "Excuse me," he said, holding up his cup. "This isn't hot." The barista at the bar barely glanced at him before rolling her eyes. "It's fine," she said. Then, before he could respond, she turned away to call the next order. Daniel stood there for a moment, stunned. His customers weren't exaggerating. The BrewPoint experience had truly fallen apart. Daniel took a seat near the window, his untouched coffee growing colder by the minute. He wasn't here for the drink. He was here to observe, to understand just how deep the dysfunction ran. From where he sat, he had a clear view of the counter and the employees behind it. The more he watched, the more uncomfortable he became. The lack of teamwork was glaring. Orders were being mixed up. Baristas bumped into each other without so much as an apology, and mistakes were met with eye rolls or muttered complaints instead of problem-solving. At one point, a customer hesitated near the counter, trying to ask about his missing order. A barista waved him off with an impatient, "It's coming." The man sighed and returned to his seat, defeated. Near the espresso machine, two employees were locked in a quiet but heated argument. "If you just followed the queue, we wouldn't be so backed up," one whispered harshly. "I am following it. Maybe if you didn't take forever making drinks, we wouldn't be in this mess," the other snapped back, slamming a milk pitcher onto the counter. Daniel's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a bad shift. This was a broken work environment. Employees weren't supporting each other. They weren't motivated. They weren't engaged. They were simply trying to survive their shift. Then there was Lisa. She wasn't perfect. She fumbled a few times, knocked over a stack of lids at one point, and her hands shook slightly as she tried to keep up, but unlike the others, she still made an effort. When a customer sighed loudly about the wait, Lisa offered an automatic "thanks for your patience," even though she got no response. When a coworker dropped a tray of cups, she instinctively bent down to help, even as the shift supervisor shot her an irritated glare. That same supervisor, Mark, was a problem in his own right. While Daniel had already seen his impatience at the register, it was even worse behind the scenes. He barked at employees, never offering encouragement, only criticism and blame. "Mia, stop messing around and move faster," he snapped, as Lisa tried to stock the pastry case. She flinched but bit back whatever response she wanted to say, placing the last croissant in the display case before rushing to take the next order. Daniel exhaled slowly. This wasn't about a single bad manager or a few lazy employees. This was systemic burnout. The staff was demotivated, unsupported, and clearly overworked. No wonder customer service was suffering. These employees had been trained to expect stress, not solutions. Staring at the chaos unfolding around him, Daniel felt a deep, growing guilt. He had built BrewPoint Café with the belief that happy employees made for happy customers, but somewhere along the way, he had let that vision slip through the cracks. Daniel continued to observe, his coffee long forgotten as the tension in the cafe mounted. The noise, the disorganization, the thinly veiled hostility between employees, it was all building towards something inevitable. He could feel it in the air. And then it happened. A middle-aged woman stepped up to the counter, her face lined with exhaustion. "I ordered a vanilla latte, but this is hazelnut," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. Lisa, stationed at the register, opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Mark swooped in. "Did you even check your receipt?" he asked, his tone flat with impatience. "We don't do remakes unless it's our mistake." The woman's brows furrowed. "I know what I ordered." Lisa quickly stepped in, her voice quieter but far more professional than her supervisor's. "It's okay, I can fix it." But Mark wasn't interested in resolution. He exhaled loudly, turned to Lisa and snapped, "Lisa, stop trying to be a hero and focus on the orders piling up." Lisa froze. Her shoulders tensed as she bit the inside of her cheek, eyes flickering between Mark and the growing line of customers. Daniel felt his stomach turn as he saw her battle between standing up for the customer or following orders that kept her in survival mode. Finally, her gaze dropped and she simply nodded, retreating to her station. The woman at the counter scoffed. Unbelievable. She shook her head and walked out, leaving her untouched drink behind. Daniel's grip tightened around his coffee cup. This was exactly what was wrong with BrewPoint Café. The service wasn't just bad, it was hostile. Employees weren't just struggling, they were being silenced by toxic leadership. And Lisa, the only one who still cared, was being shut down for it. As the shift continued, Lisa's exhaustion became more evident. Her movements slowed, her voice grew softer, and her hands trembled slightly as she fumbled with a lid. At one point, a tray of drinks slipped from her grip, sending a wave of coffee onto the counter. Mark whipped around. "Are you serious? Do you know how much that costs?" Lisa quickly grabbed napkins, her face flushing red. I didn't mean to." Mark let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "Maybe if you paid attention instead of wasting time being nice to customers, this wouldn't happen." Lisa stopped mid-measure. For the first time, she looked like she wanted to cry. That was it. Daniel had seen enough. He had started this visit thinking BrewPoint's problem was simply bad service or undertrained staff. But no, this was worse. This was a culture of fear. And it wasn't just happening here. If this was how BrewPoint ran its stores, how many more employees were suffering in silence? Daniel clenched his jaw. It was time to do something about it. Over the next week, Daniel visited multiple BrewPoint Café locations across the city, each time disguised as an ordinary customer. He walked into every shop, hoping to find a better atmosphere, hoping to prove that maybe, just maybe, the issues at Lisa's store were isolated. But what he found instead confirmed his worst fears. At one location in a busy downtown district, the tension was just as thick. The manager, a broad-shouldered man with a permanent scowl, barked orders at his staff like a drill sergeant. "I don't care if you're tired. Move faster," he snapped at a young barista who flinched and nodded quickly. Another employee, clearly frazzled and overwhelmed, fumbled while making a latte, causing a spill. Instead of helping, the manager groaned loudly. "For the love of, just step aside before you mess up more orders." Daniel clenched his jaw, recognizing the pattern: fear, exhaustion, silence. At another location in a wealthier neighborhood, he noticed a different issue: sheer indifference. The staff wasn't necessarily rude, but they weren't engaged either. They dragged their feet, responded in monotones, and barely acknowledged customers. A man ahead of Daniel in line asked about dairy-free options, and the barista just pointed to the menu without looking up. No enthusiasm, no energy, no connection. One of the most painful moments came at a quieter cafe in the suburbs. Daniel struck up a conversation with a young barista cleaning tables, a girl who couldn't have been older than 20. He casually asked, "How do you like working here?" expecting at least a neutral response. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder before answering in a hushed voice. "It's not the customers. It's the way we're treated." She wiped her cloth over the table with slow, tired motions. "The managers just yell. If something goes wrong, it's always our fault. No one ever asks why it's happening." Daniel felt a sharp pang of guilt in his chest. Across multiple locations, the symptoms were the same. Overworked and undervalued employees, toxic, impatient leadership, low morale, disengagement, and customer frustration. The worst part? No one in the corporation had noticed. He thought about Lisa, the way she had tried, despite everything, to hold on to the values BrewPoint was meant to stand for. She wasn't just an exception, she was a rarity, and in a few more months, even she might give up. By the end of the week, Daniel had a clear, undeniable conclusion. This wasn't a single broken store, this was a broken company, and he had let it happen. Sitting in his car outside the last cafe, Daniel rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. He had seen enough. It was time to take back control of BrewPoint Café. Daniel knew that observing wasn't enough. It was time to act. He couldn't just sit behind his desk and send out a corporate memo. His employees deserved better, and that meant facing them directly. So the next morning, Daniel walked into the same BrewPoint Café where it all began, the one where Lisa worked. But this time, he wasn't just another customer. He was here as the CEO. He strode up to the counter, locking eyes with Mark, the toxic shift supervisor, who looked just as impatient as before. "Excuse me," Daniel said, his voice steady but firm. "I need you to gather the staff for a quick meeting. Right now." Mark frowned, clearly thrown off. "We're busy. Maybe come back." "No," Daniel interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "This won't take long, trust me, it's important." Something in the way Daniel spoke made Mark hesitate. He glanced at Lisa, who looked just as confused as the rest of the team, before sighing and calling out, "Everyone, huddle up." The employees exchanged puzzled looks, setting aside their tasks as they slowly gathered near the counter. Customers paused mid-sip, sensing the unusual tension in the air. Daniel took a deep breath, letting his gaze pass over the exhausted faces in front of him, the people who had been keeping his business afloat while he sat in a boardroom, blind to their struggles. "My name is Daniel Morgan," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm the founder and CEO of BrewPoint Café." A heavy silence fell over the room. A barista gasped softly, Mark's eyes widened, and Lisa's lips parted in shock. "For the past week, I've been visiting my own stores, not as an executive but as a customer, and what I've seen has been unacceptable." Daniel's gaze hardened. "We've failed you. I've failed you." The weight of his words settled over the staff. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. Lisa, however, held his gaze, her expression unreadable. This company was built on connection, on making customers and employees feel valued. But somewhere along the way we lost that. Daniel's voice grew more resolute. "That ends today." Murmurs rippled through the staff. Mark crossed his arms, looking skeptical, but Daniel ignored him. "Starting now, we're making real changes." He met their gazes, one by one. "Better leadership training, improved working conditions, and actual support for our employees. Because a company isn't its logo, its branding, or its profits, it's the people behind the counter." Lisa's eyes glistened slightly, though she quickly blinked it away. "I didn't think anyone cared enough to notice," she admitted quietly. Daniel nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. "You deserve to be seen, and I promise you, change is coming." Daniel didn't just make promises, he took action. Over the following weeks, BrewPoint Café underwent a transformation from the inside out. The first step? Fixing the leadership. Toxic managers like Mark were either retrained or replaced, and a new leadership development program was launched. Every supervisor would now be required to complete a training course on how to support their employees, handle high-pressure situations, and foster a positive work environment. Next, employee well-being became a priority. Schedules were adjusted to ensure fair shifts, reducing burnout and exhaustion. Pay was reevaluated, and new policies were put in place to encourage employee feedback without fear of retaliation. A direct employee hotline was created. Anyone could report workplace issues or mistreatment anonymously, and those complaints would go straight to corporate. But the biggest change? A renewed focus on customer experience. Employees were retrained in customer service, not as a scripted routine, but as a way to rebuild trust. The goal wasn't just to serve coffee, it was to create a welcoming atmosphere again. Lisa, who had once barely held on through exhausting shifts, now stood taller. With Mark gone, her work environment improved dramatically. She was given a leadership role, helping train new employees, ones who wouldn't have to suffer through the toxic culture she had endured. She wasn't just surviving at BrewPoint anymore, she was thriving. Customers noticed the difference too. Complaints started to drop, and positive reviews slowly returned. One afternoon, Daniel visited Lisa's cafe again, not undercover this time, but as himself. He watched as Lisa greeted a customer with a genuine smile, taking the time to recommend a drink rather than rushing through the interaction. The energy of the cafe was different, lighter, warmer, more alive. Employees worked together, and while there were still the occasional mistakes, they were handled with teamwork, not blame. As Daniel picked up his coffee, now piping hot for a change, Lisa approached him hesitantly. "It feels different here now," she admitted, a small smile tugging at her lips. Daniel nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "That's because of you," he said, "because you cared enough to try, even when no one else did." Lisa shook her head. "No, it's because someone finally listened." That moment solidified everything for Daniel. BrewPoint Café wasn't just back on track, it had found its soul again. As Daniel stepped out of the cafe, the morning air felt crisper, fresher, different. Maybe it was just his imagination, or maybe it was the weight that had finally been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a detached CEO sitting in an ivory tower. He felt like a leader. Looking back through the glass storefront, he saw Lisa laugh softly as she helped a new hire with the register. The tension that had once suffocated this place was gone, replaced with something Daniel had feared was lost forever. Pride. Not just in the work itself, but in the people doing it. He thought back to the past few weeks, to the broken stores, the exhausted employees, the customers who had given up complaining because they assumed nothing would change. He had spent so long chasing growth, expansion, and profit margins that he had lost sight of the foundation that had built BrewPoint Café in the first place. Its people. That would never happen again. Change wasn't just about policies and training sessions. It was about making sure that every barista, every cashier, and every manager knew they mattered. It was about showing customers that they weren't just numbers on a sales report. It was about bringing humanity back into the business. Daniel had spent years thinking he was running a company, but now he understood he was leading one. With one last glance at the cafe, he walked down the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, his mind already racing with ideas. This was only the beginning. Because saving one cafe wasn't enough, he was going to fix them all. The story of Daniel Morgan and BrewPoint Café teaches a crucial lesson about leadership. A company is only as strong as the people who run it. Success isn't just about growth, profits, or expansion. It's about creating a culture where employees feel valued, supported, and empowered. Daniel believed his business was thriving until he saw the reality firsthand. His detachment had allowed a toxic work environment to spread, leading to burned-out employees, poor service, and unhappy customers. His experience revealed a hard truth. When employees stop caring, customers stop coming. The most important takeaway? Leadership requires presence. You can't manage a company effectively from behind a desk. True leadership means understanding the struggles of the people on the front lines, listening to their concerns, and making real changes. By acknowledging his mistakes and taking action, Daniel not only saved his business, but also restored its core values. His journey proves that leaders must lead with empathy, accountability, and a commitment to those who make success possible. Ultimately, the biggest lesson is simple: take care of your employees, and they will take care of your customers.